Good afternoon and welcome to Eurostat's webinar series. I'm Dean Vuletic, an Information and Communication Officer in Eurostat, and I'm your moderator for today's webinar. Now, the peak tourism season of summer is officially almost over, but today we're going to bring you some more summer feelings as we talk about European tourism statistics. Did you know that 12% of the nearly 3 billion tourist nights spent in the EU in 2023 were spent in only 4 top regions: the Canary Islands, Ile-de-France, Catalonia, and Adriatic Croatia? Maybe you visited one of them this summer. Or that in 2023, 719 million guest nights were spent in short-term rentals booked via Airbnb, Booking, Expedia, and Tripadvisor. That's nearly 2 million tourists per night. Today, with Eurostat's experts, we'll give you more insights into European tourism statistics. We'll discuss recent innovations and how statistical data interact with policy making. We'll also explore a cutting-edge project on data sharing with booking platforms. And you'll be able to directly ask our experts questions after their presentations. Please send the questions to us via slido.com. The Slido code is hashtag 1793815. You can see the link here on the screen and on the Eurostat stream page. On Slido, you'll also find a short survey to give us feedback on this webinar. Remember that this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it later on the Eurostat website. Now to our experts. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our first speaker, Petra Sneers, the Acting Director for Business and Trade Statistics in Eurostat. Take it away, Petra.
Thank you, Dean, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this Eurostat webinar on tourism statistics. I think the timing of this topic is just perfect, as we all still have some vivid memories of our own contribution to tourism this summer. Well, we do not know what you did last summer, but the statistics we released last week, they show that the first half of this year recorded the highest tourism figures ever. But my colleagues will tell you more about this later this afternoon. This being said, well, tourism statistics does not only sound as a fun topic to work on. I think you will surely see by the enthusiasm of my colleagues that will make the presentations this afternoon that it is really fun. But it is also a serious business. It is just like any other area of statistics. There is a whole machinery behind it, behind their production. And I hope that in an hour from now, you will know better what kind of data on tourism exists at Eurostat, how it is produced, and how we think it could evolve in the future. In the second half of the presentation, we will showcase a nice example of an innovative approach for producing statistics by reusing privately held data. And tourism statistics is really a front runner in this area. So tourism is not only fun for those who go on holidays, but it is, of course, also an important sector for the European economies and for the labor market. The impact of tourism, it became very clear by the near absence of tourism during the pandemic years. And I do not want to overload you already with some figures in this introduction, but I just want to share with you that estimates have shown that around 40% of the total economic downturn in 2020 could be attributed to the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on tourism and traveling. Furthermore, tourism is also getting more attention on the political agenda. That is clearly demonstrated by the fact that our president has proposed a commissioner in charge of sustainable transport and tourism. So this is especially in the context of the sector's sustainability in economic, cultural, and environmental terms. This is not only the case at the regional and the national level, but it is also a priority for the tourism policy in the European Commission and for our international partners such as OECD and the UN Tourism. I will now leave you in the very capable hands of our moderator, Dean, and my two colleagues, Christophe and Simon. I wish you a very exciting journey in the wonderful world of tourism statistics. Enjoy.
Thank you for your introduction, Petra, and for highlighting that recent high that has been achieved. And let's now continue our journey into the world of tourism statistics with Christophe de Manta, the team leader for tourism statistics in Eurostat. Christophe will speak about European statistics on tourism, present and future.
Thank you, Dean. Just give me a second to share the slides. This should be. I think this should be okay. Okay, thanks to Dean and to our director Petra for the introduction. Yeah, the topic is tourism. We all like tourism, but as Petra was explaining, there's also a machinery behind it that may be a bit more boring than actually traveling. But I will try to explain in a nutshell what we do, what we have. So basically, in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I hope to answer for you these very generic questions: what, who, how, when, and where. So let's start with the what, namely what kind of data do we collect and what kind of data is available for you as a user. There's some big groups. One group is statistics on rented accommodation, what we call accommodation statistics. It's data on hotels, campsites, holiday rentals, and so on. We have data on capacity, which is like the infrastructure, the number of establishments, the number of bedrooms, and so on. We also have data on occupancy, which is the number of nights spent, so the actual usage, the volume indicators in tourism. Most of this data is with an annual reference period, so we publish it annually. For the occupancy data, we also have short-term series, namely monthly data. I will start with the boring part of what we have, and the second part of my presentation will actually be some data relating to all the issues I'm mentioning here. We have data at national level and at subnational regional level, also by urban rural typology, coastal areas versus non-coastal areas. And we also have, since a couple of years, we also have data specifically on some cities, because the impact of tourism on cities also is can be quite an issue. Apart from this, like, perspective of supply of accommodation, we also have statistics on the amount of tourism by EU residents. It's basically information on how Europeans travel, how many Europeans actually participate in tourism, make trips. Not everybody is making tourism trips. We have data on the number of trips people make, how long the trips last, what destinations, how much they spend, and so on. But as I said, there will be some examples later on. We have limited, but yet some information also on the same-day visits. The bulk of our information is on trips with overnight stays, but we also have some information on the excursions. Most of this data is also only available annually. We have outside the data we collect ourselves. We also have we reuse data from other colleagues in Eurostat, for instance, to say something about the economic importance of the tourism industries. We use data from European business statistics. We use data from labor market statistics to say something about employment in tourism. Every 3 years, we try to compile or we try to use the country's data on tourism satellite accounts, but I will come back to that later. And also recently, we started publishing experimental statistics on short-term rentals, the Airbnb, Booking, Tripadvisor, Expedia story that you already heard. But my colleague Simon will guide you in detail through that project after my presentation. Maybe not the most exciting part, but how are these data produced? It's actually a cooperation between Eurostat and the national statistical offices in all the European countries. Now it gets more boring. For most your official statistics, there's a legal basis explaining what needs to be collected, how, by when it needs to be sent. The advantage is we do manage to harmonize the concepts across countries. So when you want to compare data from your country or region with data from another region or another country, it's actually comparable, or it's as comparable as possible. But this is one of the efforts that we try to make to guarantee this harmonization and comparability. As I said, the data collection, the fieldwork is usually done by the statistical offices. This platforms project is an exception to that, but more about that later. So they send the data to Eurostat, the explanatory notes or metadata, and we assemble it in EU aggregates and publish it. I will not go too much into detail on how the data is collected. Usually it's via sample surveys where enterprises or citizens reply. Some countries use administrative sources, visitor registration systems, and so on. And countries send the data to us a bit monthly or annual intervals, depending on the series. So as I said, we check and validate the data again. We calculate and publish EU aggregates and so on. So the next publication we will have on accommodation statistics is on 9th of October, which will be the monthly data for July 24. I will give some examples of data later on, but just for your information, maybe many of you are already familiar with Eurostat's website. Most of our data is available for free in our online database called Eurobase. I'm showing here an image of the data tree for tourism statistics. I mean, you can check it for yourself. I put the link there. Because not everybody is equally savvy to use online databases, we also produce some short articles. They're called Statistics Explained, and that's what they intend to do, to explain with simplified tables and simplified wording, non-statistical jargon, no political jargon, to explain a bit what's happening in European tourism. We have a whole bunch of these articles. They are regularly updated. We also try to promote these articles to bring them closer to the audience via social media posts or via news articles, which is some kind of like a press release to put a specific publication or data release a bit more under the attention. It's picked up by journalists, and this way people are aware of our data. Apart from tourism statistics, our own publications, we also contribute to many so-called horizontal publications covering several domains. I just put some of the examples here. It's just like if you want to link tourism data, for instance, regional tourism data, to other regional indicators, the regional yearbook is, of course, the best entry point. And finally, Eurostat also has a dashboard called the European Statistical Monitor. Until recently, it was called the Recovery Dashboard in the COVID aftermath. It's a dashboard with lots of short-term indicators on the European economy, society, and so on. And one of our indicators, this monthly indicator on night spent, is also included there. So far for the introduction on what we do and how we do it. Now to close, or to go to the second part of at least my contribution, I will show some examples. I put some figures here as a teaser, but most of these figures or all of these figures will come back in the slides later on. So I mentioned we have data on like the capacity or the infrastructure. This tells us that there's about 640,000 registered tourist accommodation establishments, so hotels, campsites, holiday rentals, and that these represent around 29 million bed places. A big part, 35% of these bed places, is in France and Italy. I mean, in any case, big countries, but of course also important tourism destinations. Maybe more interesting than the capacity is the actual use or the night spent in this accommodation, what we call occupancy. When we look at the most recent annual data, the previous year, 2023, we see that there was nearly 3 billion, that's a 3 with 9 zeros, spent in European accommodation facilities in 2023, 2.3% higher than 2019. I mean, why 19 and not 22? It's just to indicate that the levels in 2023 were higher than the pre-pandemic levels. So the tourism sector, I mean, we heard from our director in the introduction how heavily the COVID impacted tourism and how heavily the absence of tourism impacted the overall economy. So at least from our data, we see that tourism, an EU average, there's of course country differences behind it, that the EU tourism has actually recovered from COVID. There's always a slight dominance in domestic tourists, so nights spent by people in their own country, but it's about 50-50. Probably not surprisingly, Spain and Italy attracted most foreign tourists. France, Greece, and Croatia followed. As I said, these are like somehow teasers. Of course, you can find much more detailed information in the articles I mentioned or in the databases. Just to give an idea of the long-term growth, this shows that tourism nights spent from 2009 to 2023. Of course, this dip is explained by the dip in 2020, and the recovery in the following years is, of course, COVID. But also here you see that the 2023 levels were above 19. When we look in the longer term, actually, the number of tourism nights in 23 was 43% higher than 15 years earlier. So it's definitely a sector that is growing and growing with an average annual growth rate of 2.6%, which could have, of course, been higher without the dip in 2021 and 22. An important issue in tourism is seasonality, or the seasonal variation of nights spent. I mean, people tend to concentrate their holidays in the summer months. It's a politically relevant topic because, I mean, of course, it has a link to the efficient use of infrastructure because hotels are there, and I mean, the more their use is spread throughout the year, the better. Of course, it also has an impact on the quality of jobs, with probably unemployment in the bottom months and stronger employment in the peak months. And of course, it also has an impact on tourism pressure and environmental factors. So we use our monthly data on nights spent as an indicator here. And we see on average for the EU that about 1/3 of the nights spent was spent in just 2 months, in July and August. Again, behind this EU average, there are big differences. There's countries with countries with an important winter season will typically have a lower seasonality because they have several peak seasons. A country like Croatia, even more than half of the nights spent is spent in just these 2 months. Now, the last set of figures on the accommodation data, and our director already mentioned it in the introduction. In the first half of 2024, that's the most recent data we have, there were 1.2 billion nights spent, which was, as was mentioned, the highest figure ever. So this post-COVID recovery is definitely visible in our data. It's 2.3% higher than last year and 4.3% higher than the first half of 2019. And we saw increases in all except 3 EU countries. So it's Sweden, Belgium, and France at the end of the EU part of the graph. But even there, the drops are relatively small. Finally, no, still about the accommodation, sorry. The regional data, regional data is important at Eurostat, but in particular for tourism, because often tourism policy or tourism promotion is done at regional level or destination level, not always at country level. So the monitoring of the regional data is an important thing. Also, because we see that there's quite a dominance of specific regions. It's probably the usual suspect. So there's about, in the classification of regions, I will not go into detail about that classification. There's about 250 regions in Europe, and only 7 of those 250 regions account for about 20% of these 3 billion nights spent. The so-called champions, it's the Canary Islands, Adriatic, Croatia, Catalonia, Ile-de-France, like Dean already mentioned in his introduction, followed by Andalusia, Veneto, and Balearic Islands. So if you look at these regions on a map, it's like 7 small dots on the European map, but this is actually where 1/5 of the tourism is happening. Just in the small front for comparison, like the number of nights spent in the Canary Islands, just one group of islands belonging to Spain, is higher than the night spent in entire Portugal, the night spent in Poland. Sorry, the night spent in Adriatic Croatia or Catalonia, it's higher than the night spent in entire Portugal, and so on. So it's quite striking to see the dominance of some of the regions when it comes to EU tourism. Another regional distinction can be looking at coastal areas versus non-coastal areas. Again, if you would draw, I mean, you just need a pen to go around the coastlines of Europe. You will not cover a lot of territory, but in this relatively small part of the EU territory, actually 48% of nights spent are in coastal areas. Coastal areas, we define it as like more or less the area 10 kilometers away from between the sea and 10 kilometers away inland. Just a little bit of information on how Europeans travel. As I mentioned earlier, not all Europeans are participating in tourism. Probably everybody who attends this webinar has a genuine interest in tourism because they like traveling themselves, but actually quite some Europeans do not participate in tourism, meaning they do not make any trip throughout the year with overnight stays. Every 3 years, we ask people for the reasons why. If they declare that they are not traveling, it's often financial reasons. There's also quite a big group who says, I'm simply not interested. For me, holidays, it's having a beer in my own garden. I don't need to go to other countries. There's also people who indicate health reasons, which might, of course, be linked to age. At a certain age, it might become more difficult to actually participate in tourism and stay away from home. Again, those who do travel, they do travel quite a lot. They make more than 1 billion tourism trips. Again, the majority of the trips, it's trips in the own country. Here as well, we see, like for instance, in France, there's a huge majority of domestic trips because, I mean, it's a big country. You have and cities and mountains and lakes and beaches. In smaller countries, you're, of course, more easily traveling abroad. About half of these trips were trips with 4 nights or more, so longer trips. On these 1 billion trips, people spend about 5.4 billion nights and spend about 475 billion of their household budget on these trips. When we look only at the foreign trips, which is about 25% of the total number of trips, the vast majority of foreign trips are actually still trips to other EU countries. So when Europeans travel, or they prefer their own country or other European countries. So there's not that many trips that actually have a destination outside the EU. And even those that are outside the EU are often countries very close to the EU, like the UK, Turkey, Switzerland, and the US as a big destination. My last slide with data, it's about the thing I call tourism satellite accounts. It's a complex thing, but it's basically a way to assess the economic or macroeconomic importance of the tourism sector. So how much does tourism contribute to the economy and to the labor market? There's many indicators, but I just use one. Tourism direct cross value added, without explaining what it is. Basically, it shows that EU tourism represents about 4.5% of the European economy. So you can compare that with other sectors like agriculture, transport, and so on. And we see that tourism is definitely not a non-significant sector, and maybe justifies the choice to have a commissioner portfolio dedicated to tourism. So the value added of tourism was 570 billion euro the last time we collected this data before the pandemic, to have, let's say, non-biased data because of the pandemic. Again, behind this 4.5%, of course, there are much higher shares in Croatia, Portugal, in countries like Luxembourg, it's lower. Finally, just one word. I explained what data we have now and a bit how we collect it. Of course, we also try to work, let's say, to adapt to 21st century standards. So we are, I mean, some of the projects we have in the pipeline, it's further implementation of tourism satellite accounts, because we do have a very strong demand on economic data, like not just only the tourism flows and the number of trips and nights spent, but also like what is the economic value behind this sector. In terms of methodology, we try to reuse existing data instead of starting new surveys. We will use this approach for a project on to produce indicators on the sustainability of tourism. Also, we explore new sources, smart surveys instead of old paper or web surveys. We explore cooperating with mobile network operators to use payments card data, to use data from online platforms, which we will hear about very soon. And this is, of course, not only happening at Eurostat, also in the national statistical offices. There's many of these initiatives that we try to, we try to make sure that countries exchange their experiences. So there's we hope that all these things will lead in the short to midterm to hopefully faster data, more detailed data, but without extra burden. This was it from my side. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I think I leave you again in the hands of Dean.
Thank you, Christoph, for showing us those directions in European tourism statistics. And now let's learn more about short stay accommodation offered via online platforms with Simon Blay, a statistical officer in Eurostat who also specializes in tourism statistics. The floor is yours, Simon.
Thank you, Dean, and welcome everybody also from my side. I wish you all a great afternoon, and I'd like to apologize in advance if I sound a bit congested. I promise that the only person that I will be infecting is Christoph, and because I actually share an office with him. Let me put on my slides and I'll get started right away. Well, that should be it. All right. So, as Dean already mentioned, I will be talking about an innovative project that we've launched a few years ago, the short stay accommodation rentals project. And did you know that in 2023, Paris was the most popular city destination in the EU in terms of short-term rentals, with 19.3 million nights spent there. And second and third place came Rome and Barcelona with 12.5 and 10.9 million nights respectively. Also, did you know that in 2023 we had around 720 million guest nights spent in apartments that were booked through one of the 4 platforms that we are covering, which are Airbnb, Booking, Expedia, and Tripadvisor. That means around 66 million bookings, so 720 million guest nights, and each booking had around 10 guest nights. And the 66 million bookings correspond to about 125 per minute. If you do know this, then you've probably heard of the short-term rentals project, because this is where the data is coming from. And in the next 10 minutes, I will explain to you how we managed to get hold of this data, how the agreements with the 4 platforms are set up. I'll show you what kind of data is available and how you can access it. And then I will conclude with a short data tour about the most recent data. Okay, let's start. How does it work? So we have separate agreements with 4 major online booking platforms, namely Airbnb, Booking.com, Expedia, and Tripadvisor. These 4 platforms, they send data to us, which are aggregated at a local level. So it's important to say that they're not sending data about each and every individual apartment or object in the EU, but they aggregate this at a local level. So for each commune in the EU, we get a line of data specifying how many nights were spent here in accommodation rented out through that particular platform. This is what we're getting from the 4 platforms. They send this to us 4 times each year, and we then do the statistical production. So we merge the 4 files coming from the 4 platforms, because it's very important to point out, and it's very important to those platforms, that we never share or disseminate data that pertains to only one of the 4 platforms. So we're not sharing any business secrets or any confidential numbers that only pertain to one of the platform, but everything that we're sharing is merged across those 4 platforms. So this is basically the first step. We validate the data and check if it makes sense, and then we produce a number of output tables, which we put in our database and on our website, and which we use to produce a number of articles. That's the one release stream, and on the other hand, we're also sharing the data with our partners in the National Statistical Institutes. We share it with them a few weeks in advance, so before we publish it, and this serves 2 purposes. On the one hand, they can double check the data because basically they know better what's going on in their countries, and they might be better placed to point out inconsistencies in the data. So it serves as an additional layer of quality assurance. And secondly, they use the data to prepare their own publications. Now, if you allow me a short tangent, this is a bit different than how European statistics in the European statistical systems are normally organized. So in Christoph's presentation, you learned a bit how it usually works. So usually what happens is there's a regulation where Eurostat specifies what we want, what kind of variables do we want, and these kind of things. I'm not going into the detail right now, but basically the regulations are descriptive, saying this is what we want. Please send it to us. And then the technical aspects, the implementation, the survey design, methodological decisions, these are left to the member states. So they collect the data on their end and they send it to us. Now here with this short-term rentals project, it's actually the other way around, because we collect the data from the respondents, which are the 4 platforms, and then we split it up by country and send it back to the country. So it's exactly the opposite approach than what we usually do. And of course, it makes sense in this environment with the short-term rentals, where you have a small number of players, Airbnb, Booking, Expedia, etc., that are all not just available in 1 or 2 countries, but across the EU. So it's much more efficient to collect this data centrally and then send it out to the countries. But of course, this means that especially in the beginning of the project, there were quite a few reservations from the countries, if that is the correct approach. Or it was just a new thing, I would say, in the statistical system to organize it that way. But enough about the internal cuisine of the statistical system. Let's get back to the data itself. So what do we have? We have basically occupancy data. Occupancy data is information on the number of stays. So that corresponds to the number of individual bookings that we have, the number of nights spent, and the third variable that we cover is the number of guest nights. To give you a short example how the 3 variables correspond to each other, imagine for a second that you're booking a weekend trip to Berlin. So 2 nights, Friday, Saturday, Saturday, Sunday, for a family of 4. So that's 1 stay or 1 booking. It's 2 nights spent, Friday, Saturday, Saturday, Sunday, and it's 8 guest nights, since you're 4 people that spend 2 nights each. 2 times 4 is 8. These variables are available by month at the highest level of geographical breakdown. So for the EU, the country, and the higher levels of our regional hierarchy. And then for the lowest regional breakdowns, and for the cities, it's only available annually. And then there's another number of breakdowns that you can use to do additional analysis, and I will show some of this after at the end of my presentation. the data covers holiday and short stay accommodation. So what you would naively assume to find when you check on Airbnb, for example, this is all covered by the data. So no hotels, no campsites, stuff like this, only short-term rentals. And the data is available on our website. I put the link here. I wrote it out here so you can copy it and have a look. On our website, there's a dedicated section on the short-term rentals project where you can find links to the database and our articles, our news releases, but also to a methodological document, for example, and the initial launch of the project. So yeah, that is all available on our website as a central hub. And we have 8 data tables that show various aspects of the data, which are available on Eurobase, our database, available under the link in the center. But you can find all of this on the website that you find if you follow the main link printed in the bottom. And we have a series of wiki articles. One shorter wiki article is updated 4 times a year. And then there's one that is a bit more in-depth and shows a bit a higher number of indicators, and that is updated annually. And before I go into the data itself, I want to be honest with you and share the current limitations of the data. So what we're not covering. It's basically 3 things that we're not covering as of today. And one thing is the capacity. So if you imagine a homeowner sharing their apartment on the internet, they'll probably share it using several platforms. I only put Airbnb and Booking as an example here. But imagine he or she puts it on both these platforms, and then we get information about these listings in the data coming from Airbnb and Booking. We have no way of telling that it's the same listing. So that is why we do receive currently the capacity data, but we're not in a position to publish it. And then finally, there's a similar issue with occupancy data coming through the project, but also through the traditional tourism statistics that Christoph was describing before my presentation, which means that we might not be able to compare the data directly. I mean, you can, of course, compare hotel rooms and short-term rentals, but it's a bit hard to do the full comparison with the total numbers. And finally, we don't have price data because it's not a part of the agreements with the platforms. But enough about the limitations. Let's just have a short look at what is actually available, what you can use for your analysis. And here, right at the top level, let's look at the 2023 data, the blue line that you can see in the graph on the left. We had almost 720 million guest nights in 2023 in short-term rentals across the European Union, which is a plus of about 20% compared to the year before that, 2022. And if you look at the pre-pandemic numbers, 2019, they have been exceeded already in 22. So the growth is really substantial, and the growth is higher than for other sectors of the tourism market, such as hotels. It's growing quite quickly. And if you drill down a bit more or deeply at the regional level, so this is the so-called NUTS2 layer. So this is the middle layer of our regional classification. You can drill down even further in something called NUTS3, but then you get less breakdowns and less timely data. So then it's only annual. So these are the guest nights in 2023 at the NUTS2 regional level. And the larger the blue circles are, the more guest nights were spent in the region in question. So you can see quite clearly that the Mediterranean coast seems to be quite popular, and that the most popular regions were in France, Spain, and Italy. And the three most popular regions in 2023 were Andalusia, the Adriatic Croatian coast, and Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur in France. And we also have data on cities, and these are around 250 cities in the EU. So we have all the capital cities, we have the largest cities, and we have the cities that are of touristic importance, also judging by the number of nights spent there. And the five most popular ones are Paris, Rome, Barcelona, Lisbon, and Madrid. And finally, to drill down a bit deeper, just two examples of the type of analysis that is possible with the data. You saw before in Christoph's presentation the seasonality bar, and here we have the seasonality of short-term rental nights spent broken down by origin of the guests. So you have the brown greenish line, which refers to domestic tourists, and the red line, which refers to foreign tourists. And you can see that the shape is actually quite a bit different for the two. So in total, you have August as the most busy month, but for foreign tourists, it's actually July that is a bit more popular than August. And if you look at December, you can see that in the Christmas period, you have a high share of domestic travelers, which is of course not surprising. And finally, another breakdown that I wanted to show to you is the share of international guest nights in the total guest nights. So across the EU, about 6 of 10 nights in short-term rentals were by international guests, so coming from outside the country. But this is widely variable across countries. So you have smaller countries, Malta, Croatia, Slovenia, or Luxembourg, where we're located, which have above 90% share of international tourists. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have big countries such as France, Germany, Poland, with a very low share of international tourists, because I guess people from these countries like to spend time in their own country as well. That brings me to the end. If you want to stay in touch, here's my email address, and I share again the link to the site on our website where you can access the data. And that's it for now. I will give back the floor to Dean, and thanks for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon, for your expert insights. The two presentations have given us so much information about European tourism statistics that I think it's time to make some bookings. But let me first of all invite you to ask questions. Remember that you can send us questions via slido.com. The code is #1793815. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions now, we'll follow up and send you answers. As part of the question and answer session, Christoph and Simon will take the stage once again. Our Eurostat experts are ready to answer your questions, so remember slido.com, #1793815. And let's start with the first question. For Christoph, is there open data available on European tourism numbers, demographics, tourist provenance, and so on?
Thanks, Dean, and thanks to the person who submitted the question and other questions. We mentioned a few times in our presentations Eurobase, which is basically Eurostat's online database. This is actually the main place where you can find all our data. It's not always the micro data from the surveys, but it's like the quite deep aggregate data. So that this would be the place to go to find our data. And of course, I tried to showcase in my presentation as much of the data we have as possible. Of course, not everything. Like, of course, we also have data, for instance, in the accommodation statistics about the country of origin of the guests, which is probably the tourism providence that the person was referring to. So I would invite the person who asked the questions to have a look on Eurobase, to look at the tables, the different dimensions in the tables, and if help is needed, I think people can always contact Eurostat user support, who will answer or who will contact us in the team to provide an answer.
Okay, thank you very much, Christoph. Now, to our next question. One of our viewers is asking if we could provide more details on Malta's inbound tourism. Where can that information be accessed?
I think that's again for me, and the answer is probably quite similar to the previous answer. I mean, there's a huge amount of data available in our website. When I say a huge amount, sometimes it's too much information. That's why we have these explanatory articles, or that's why users can also contact user support if they need more like customized information. So as I said, when we're talking about inbound tourism in Malta, I mean, we do have statistics about accommodation in Malta and where the guests came from, if this is the kind of information that the person is looking at. If it's about the value of the inbound tourism, we would need to look into satellite accounts data and so on. But I mean, the details of the question probably goes a bit out of scope of the quick Q&A we want to have here. But there's definitely information available.
Thank you, Christoph. And now, Simon, a question for you. Do you have any idea about the share of total STR platforms that the 4 data providers account for across the EU?
Thank you for this question. We don't have the exact share, of course, but we did do some cooperation with some of the member states that looked into the market and also checked some regional platforms that are available in their country only, and we're currently investigating the results of this. So we should know more quite soon. And finally, or secondly, there's another project currently ongoing where we're looking at credit card data that can be attributed to market sectors such as these platforms, and that could also be an avenue of finding out or estimating the market shares of these platforms. So nothing to announce now if this is going to impact the project in the future, but this is basically the avenues that we're following to find out more about this.
And a related question, Simon, is the STR data only related to privately owned accommodation rented by these platforms?
Yeah, it's all the accommodation that is in that category, so short-term rentals, that is available on one of these 4 platforms. So I'm not going to go too deeply into the rabbit hole that is statistical classifications, but basically we're excluding hotels and campsites. Most other things are covered by the short-term rental data.
Great, thank you for that response. Christoph, I think another question for you. Could you share with us some trends that are unique to each European country? Well, I don't think we have time now to go through the 27 EU member states, but maybe some highlights?
I think I can just pick a few things that I mentioned in the presentation. I mean, it's always difficult if it applies to each country or like 26 of the 27. But like, I mean, one trend is for sure that most or all countries recovered from the pandemic when it comes to the tourism sector. Second one is that, again, I'm not sure if it applies to all countries, but definitely to most. That's the segment that Simon was talking about, the accommodation booked through platforms. It tends to grow faster than the night spent in the, let's say, the other ways of accommodation. So these would be 2 things I I want to mention here.
Okay, thank you, Christoph. Now, Simon, another question regarding your topic. Will Eurostat be able to use the data that will be collected based on the latest STR regulation?
Yes, and this is actually great news for us. There is now an article in that regulation that foresees the transmission of data coming out of the regulation, both to national statistical institutes and to Eurostat. So we will get access to this data, which is very good. However, it will probably be a few years until we get that data. And even then, I don't know how familiar you are with the regulation, but basically the regulation is opt-in at country level. So a country might decide to not set up the registries that are foreseen in the registration. That means that we also wouldn't receive data for that country or that region. So it remains to be seen if we will get the complete coverage through the STR regulation, but we will receive the data that is being collected. So that is really great news for us and the colleagues in the countries.
Thank you, Simon, for that update. Now, are there available data about nights spent at tourist accommodation by month in the NUTS 2 before 2020? As one of our viewers is asking because they would like to research a wider range.
Yeah. When I say yes or no, of course, it's not a very clear answer. I'll try to specify. As I mentioned, for all these things, there's like a regulation underlying the data production. We made minor changes to the regulation in 2019, and because of that, as of 2020, we also have the monthly accommodation data by NUTS 2, or the regional data also at monthly level. So at Eurostat, it is not available before 2019, but if the user is interested in a specific country, I think the user can contact the statistical office of his home country or her home country. They might have the data available. I mean, typically this accommodation statistics, it's a sample of enterprises, hotels, so it should be possible for the statistical office to construct the data, but it was only systematically collected from the member states by Eurostat as of reference year 2020. So that's why I say no, not at Eurostat, but yes, probably in the member state concerned.
Okay, thank you, Christoph, for explaining that. Now, is the data that the two of you have presented integrated into the tourism dashboard, or are there only selected indicators that are presented there?
Yeah, I will take this one maybe. I would say yes and yes. Maybe first of all, the tourism dashboard, it's not a Eurostat product, it's a European Commission product. But it's not Eurostat that is in the lead of producing, defining the dashboard, but actually the data behind the dashboard. I mean, our colleagues from the Joint Research Center of the Commission who designed this dashboard, the data they use is largely taken from our data. So while it's from the output point of view, it's not a Eurostat product. The input is largely Eurostat data. The main reason is that, I mean, I hope the main reason is because our data is good. Of course, the other reason is there's no point in reinventing the wheel and doing double data collection. So this is, I mean, we are like the agency in charge of producing statistics on all kind of topics in Europe, and our colleagues in other parts of the Commission, they do know that we are the reference and they try to reuse. So when you go to the tourism dashboard and you look at the methodological notes, you will see that a lot of the data is actually Eurostat series.
Okay, thank you, Christoph. Now, a question on definitions. What's the difference between rented accommodation, as we saw in Christoph's presentation, and the short stay accommodation that we heard about in Simon's presentation?
I think I can quickly try to explain this. So basically, the data that is covered in short-term rentals in theory, it should be a subset of the rented accommodation in the tourism statistics, because all the objects that are on Airbnb and Booking and so on, they are of course also part of the set of objects that we're interested in for tourism statistics. But the opposite is not true. So you could have a short-term accommodation that is not advertised on Airbnb. So that means in theory, my data should be a subset of Christoph's data. However, in practice, what we have is that, now this goes again in the nitty-gritty of the regulation, is that there's a threshold applied in several countries where tourism statistics does not cover objects that are under a certain threshold of bed places. So that has practical reasons, because in countries with a high number of touristic accommodations, you have all these small objects that may only be advertised locally by road signs, for example, and it was just technically very difficult, bordering on impossible, to have all these be part of the tourism survey. So, and this is also one of the big reasons why we've launched the short-term rentals project, because now most of these objects are advertised through the platforms. And so we saw this as a convenient way to get this data with a relatively low effort compared to having a huge survey for all these small accommodation providers. I hope that made it clear.
Yes, thank you very much, Simon. Now, another question. Can you provide more details and examples of indicators regarding tourism sustainability using existing official statistics? Or what kind of indicators do you plan to use?
Maybe to pick up and the previous question, actually the EU tourism dashboard already includes some indicators that link to sustainability of tourism. Again, as I said, underlying our data. It's not a webinar about sustainability, but just to explain that sustainability, it's several dimensions, not only the environmental dimension, it's also economic sustainability, which means like performance of the sector, sustainability in terms of labor market, job creation, and so on. So some of the examples I gave in my presentation is that we try to reuse, for instance, labor market statistics. So indicators related to that aspect of sustainability, or let's say quality of jobs, could be comparing the length of service in a job in tourism compared to the rest of the sector, the share of higher educated versus lower educated, the share of foreign workers versus non-foreign workers, just to see to what extent this creates chances on the labor market, just have that dimension. When we're talking about economic sustainability, of course, we will look at the other existing business statistics, data like comparing productivity in tourism compared to other sectors. Actually, the most difficult dimension to measure is actually the environmental dimension. There's a lot of environmental statistics available at Eurostat, but not always at the, let's say, it doesn't make that much sense to analyze environmental elements at national level when it comes to tourism, because often, if you look at national level or at annual level, all, for instance, seasonal peaks will be leveled out. So that's a bit, we try to see what is around in Eurostat, also to avoid starting new surveys, creating new statistics. We first want to see to what extent we can fill the user need of data on sustainable tourism using all the existing statistics. But it's work in progress. It has been going for a while. It will continue. We hope to come out with a first set of indicators and a publication like in the course of next year. But in the meantime, as I said, to some extent, the dashboard also covers some information on sustainability. And this is also let's say a task, a job we're doing in close cooperation with UN Tourism. Formerly the World Tourism Organization, because all countries in the world are concerned by the balancing tourism. Let's say the success of tourism with the possible perks of tourism.
Thank you, Christoph, for that very detailed response. Now, it's unfortunately time to wrap up our seminar on tourism statistics. We've had a lot of questions from you. Thank you very much for participating, and thank you to our speakers, Petra, Christoph, and Simon. To our viewers, thank you for joining us, and once again for sending your very interesting questions. Please also participate in our feedback survey via Slido. There you can also find the address to contact our multilingual user support if you have further questions. And join us for our next seminar on the EU enlargement and Eurostat statistical cooperation. That seminar will take place on the 17th of October at 11 a.m. And we'll use that webinar as well to mark European Statistics Day, which takes place on the 20th of October. We hope to see you again then. For now, from Eurostat in what is today a very sunny Luxembourg, I'm Dean Vuletic, wishing you happy travels.